Karin, it's lovely to have you here, and I'm looking forward to hearing you explore some of the research and reflection that you've been doing, thinking about the way in which the transmission of Buddhism has left us in large part with a more anthropocentric version of Buddhism than is actually helpful or necessary. And I wonder if we could start by your explaining or sharing your thoughts on why it's important for Buddhist practitioners or human beings living in this moment to rethink the way that we are relating to the more than human world.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm glad we are finally getting a chance to do this. Let me speak to the human being first. I think it's the case that our survival depends on not just rethinking the way we relate to the more than human world, but reorienting how we are relating, changing, transforming how we are relating to the more than human world. Um, the relationship to the natural world, our relationship to the natural world is so out of balance that it is threatening our own physical health and well-being, as well as the well-being of the more than human world, both animal, plant, mineral. Um, and from a Buddhist perspective, I think we could say that our awakening maybe depends on this as well. Maybe it wasn't always the case, but I think there's a way to see this crisis that we find ourselves in as intimately related to um, our own egoism, ignorance, selfishness. Um, so, I mean, I can say that there's multiple reasons or stories about how we got here. And by we, I want to be speaking of persons living in modern industrial societies. So people like you and me, and probably most, maybe all of your audience. Um, and we might have different religious backgrounds, initially different cultural backgrounds, but we share living in a modern industrialized kind of world. And for different religious and scientific worldviews have contributed to severing our ability to see, feel, hear, and arguably to communicate with the more than human world. Um, and like many others in this space, I see these converging crises of converging environmental, social, political, and even personal psychological crises that are on the rise at this time as essentially a kind of spiritual crisis. And from a Buddhist perspective, as I suggested, the Anthropocene can be seen as a kind of egoism, an entrancement with the delusion of separation, or even as a closing down of the heart. And if this is true, then awakening must not only involve a transformation of ourselves individually on our own, but our transformation of our relationship well, with each other, but also with the more than human world. Um, so I think that's why, to me, it seems important, and both from larger human perspective, but also from a Buddhist perspective.
I wonder if you could explore some of the resources that we find within Buddhism that might have helped us to feel differently, to sense differently, to connect differently beyond the human from within Buddhist teachings and practices, um, but that aren't generally transmitted or made prominent or visible outside Asia.
Yeah. And here, I think maybe I'd start with what's missing. What's missing from the way that we're practicing or encountering Buddhism in the West. And I'm going to speak here primarily of convert Buddhism. I'm not really speaking to heritage Buddhism as practiced in the West.
Could you just define convert and heritage Buddhism?
Yeah,
Just
so I just mean that if you're not, if that the practice has been transmitted from Asia and practiced here in the way that it was practiced in Asia, without modifications for presenting to a Western audience, then I would call that more heritage. And maybe there's some modifications. Whereas for a convert community, I would say primarily you didn't grow up Buddhist, but you found it as an adult or young person, and maybe your parents. Like I did have some, like second when I taught in Nepal, some second generation Buddhists that I don't know. I guess they were the children of convert Buddhists. Um, so I guess what I mean to just get my larger point here is that when we encounter Buddhism in the West in English language, let's put it that way, or Spanish, Spanish or a Western language, it's often presented as a spiritual alternative to religion, right? A kind of rationalized spirituality that's compatible with modern science, and it's devoid of anything that seems incompatible with a modern scientific and largely physicalist or materialist worldview. This is stuff that we would label as supernatural. Um, so it's devoid of this kind of supernatural. Um, I'm not crazy about the word supernatural because I think it's set up to be a category, of derision, um, in contrast to the natural. Um, but here, I would mean things that kind of defy our expectations of how the material world operates. And so we could talk about um, kind of psychic phenomena, paranormal phenomena, um, something that can't be explained by our current physical sciences, basically. And so we get presented with a kind of Buddhism that's thoroughly rational and thoroughly consistent with a kind of modern scientific worldview. And it's an alternative to whatever religious traditions maybe that people grew up with. And this is a very different kind of worldview than the cultural worlds that Buddhism traditionally inhabits in Asia. Um, and in this worldview, in the West, the more than human world is often seen as dead, as devoid of mind or spirit, as a kind of object or resource. Like, how can we extract some value from it, instead as an other with whom we are in relation. Um, and many cultures around the world um, view the natural world as something um, maybe inhabited by beings, but in any case, something that we are in relationship with, a kind of ethical a relationship that demands respect. It's not mere object.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and so I would say that most traditional forms of Buddhism understand there to be, and here I might speak both culturally. So culturally, there's a notion of a reciprocal relationship with the more than human world, often in Buddhist cultures. Also in Buddhist philosophy, there's an idea that it's not kind of world out there and mind in here. Instead, there's a kind of reciprocal relationship between mind and world. And the world um, in Buddhist philosophy permits this, and then we see it across Buddhist cultures. The world is inhabited by all kinds of intelligent beings that are other than human beings.
Could you talk a little bit about the philosophical underpinnings that allow us to see that consciousness permeates the world, and the way that the material world, the natural world, in turn is enlivening consciousness? Or
Yes.
however you might want to put it. You don't need
Yeah.
to.
In truth, we look across Buddhist history, and there's been different philosophical views on exactly how mind, and here I usually put the third term as action. So karma in traditional Buddhist term, but mind, action, and world are in this dynamic relationship. It's not like kind of this separate thing. And then world, of course, includes other beings with minds. Um, and in some Buddhist contexts, they might put a little more emphasis on mind being everywhere or everything being part of mind. Everything is Buddha nature, Buddha mind. Um, and in other philosophical traditions, I don't know how much your audience has studied, there might be a more kind of I don't want to say, but a dualistic, or there might be more emphasis on matter being also fundamentally real, and there's being a kind of interaction between mind and matter, a dependent kind of interdependent reaction that neither is existing independently. And so wherever you fall on that spectrum, there's a kind of mind and matter and reciprocal relationship, or there is mind everywhere, or everything is ultimately Buddha mind, awakened mind. Wherever you fall on that spectrum, there's a great respect for the role of mind in shaping reality. And that it is, which just gets kind of written out of the picture in our modern kind of inherited view of, initially there was a kind of separation. There's sort of spirit and there's matter. And then the spirit in kind of modern recent scientific developments, eventually the mind gets extracted altogether, and we're not even sure, is consciousness does it really exist? How does it exist in relationship to the brain, right? This is famously the hard problem of consciousness in modern philosophy. But because of the emphasis on mind and the importance of the world being shaped by our own ignorance and craving, or absence of ignorance and craving from the very beginning in Buddhism, there's um, a strong interest in the reality and fundamental role of mind, but also then in the ethical guidelines of how we relating to the world is shaping how we experience the world. And we can talk about this in terms of, again, karma is a traditional way of talking about that. And also in our contemplative practices. So how we transform our minds and hearts changes how we experience the world and really what the world is, right? It's created collectively by our actions in most traditional Buddhist worldviews. So, as a modern Western person, I don't think it makes sense, at least for me, to adopt a particular traditional Buddhist culture and view. That's never felt quite right. But I do think we can learn a lot by looking collectively at Buddhist cultures and kind of how they think Buddhist concepts, what they exclude or include in reality and in moral consideration, um, and and to see how our own ideas, our own concepts of Buddhist ideas have been limited or narrowed maybe by our own cultural histories.
Mhm.
Um, so I could elaborate maybe on some of those. I think that was your initial question, with some of those concepts.
Yeah, let's go to some of the concepts.
Yeah. So one, for example, is dependent um, origination or dependent arising. And this And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that this happens, but it's often really scientized. Even in the space of eco-dharma, it's often scientized, meaning that instead of explaining what I just talked about there, the interdependence of mind, action, and world, or minds, actions, and a collective or shared world, it gets applied to the physical interaction, maybe of in the environment, elements in the environment, or maybe even our bodies in the environment. And that's fine. Bodies in the physical environment are important. Um, but it's only part of the story. And when that physical becomes the focus, it again has a tendency to become object, something to be manipulated rather than, um, and it cuts off the possibility of a deeper, more intimate, reciprocal relationship with the more than human world. Um, and there's no reason we need to do that. We look across the Buddhist cultures and the different ways that they've understood dependent origination, the different ways they've understood human beings to relate to the more than human world. There's no reason to um, limit our thinking about dependent origination to a kind of, physicalist conception.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about the application of dependent arising that you're calling us back to is that it sort of flattens the distinction between mental causes or spiritual causes, inner causes, if you want to call it that, and outer causes. So you can have some of the conditions that come together could be our attitudes or our intentions, and other conditions could be what we consider material, and they come together and interact. So that's a space where we do see a kind of commingling of mind and matter, if you want to put it that way.
Mhm. Yeah, and I maybe made it sound more dualist and just trying to simplify it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
how we've gotten off track in the West, um, in kind of the modern, extractive view of nature. Um, but I think you're right, and I think a lot of contemplative practices are actually exploring those interactions. Um, and another piece of this, I think, is that we tend to have this view of knowledge um, in the West that's very static. So we have kind of, if I perform this experiment and you can reproduce it, then it counts as knowledge, right? Or if I can rationally defend it, right, then that might count as knowledge. But traditionally, in the kind of view of the transformation that takes place through contemplative practice, actually, the way you know things is transformed by your practice. You, as a knower, are transforming your instrument of knowing or knowledge, your mind and your heart and your body as well. I mean, that's um, also often part of it. And so a lot of the contemplative practices are, yeah, they're reorienting that instrument and creating a kind of sensitivity for interacting with the more than human world. And maybe it wasn't always traditionally understood this way. I think we can find specific instances. Um, and I'd need to do like a kind of is not my area, but an anthropological study of Buddhist cultures to find, different examples of how Buddhists have um, interacted with the environment or other beings, including invisible beings, um, or spirits, or yeah, elements of the more than human world have been conceived differently across Buddhist cultures, but it involves a kind of technology, a ritual technology, a kind of contemplative technology. And just even in basic traditional Buddhist practices of like four elements, for example, there's many ways of practicing with the four or five or six, depending on which which Buddhist tradition you're drawing from. But even with the four material elements, um, you're meditating on the qualities of them in your body, but also on how they are appearing in the world around you, and eventually seeing a continuity between that. Um, in the Brahma Viharas, for example, or I don't know if you call them the four immeasurables in your community, but immeasurable um, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, um, these also are they're transforming yourself and your own heart, but they're also transforming that relationship with the more than human world. And there's kind of different ways that they've been practiced in Buddhist traditions. In the suttas, there's a way of practicing with the Brahma Viharas where you're really extending out. And in some of those early suttas, talking about extending um, the Brahma Viharas out physically, right, to the different quarters and above and below and so on. Um, there we have mention of all kinds of uh, other than human beings or more than human beings. Um, Maybe I'll just note I like more than human beings because other makes we tend to read as lesser. And so they are other than human beings. It doesn't always have that connotation, but I think more kind of helps rebalance that the respect, some of the respect we've lost for other than human beings. So I've gone on a bit here, so maybe you want to stop me and
I would like to come back to the idea of karma,
Mhm.
um, and as a way, as a concept that I think people sometimes are not that comfortable with or don't quite know how to relate to. Um, and maybe it fits into the category of problematic topics that don't quite make the filter when trying to package Buddhism in a way that's attractive to more scientifically oriented modernists. But one of the people that I interviewed previously in this series, Roberto Garcia, who's a Robert Ho professor at the Colegio de Mexico in Mexico, has done work and written and shared some really interesting reflections on the ways in which collective karma can walk us into this space where we are clearly in a co-creating process of our environment and vice versa. And I just wonder if you could, since you put action or karma so central in the weaving together of this world, with this multi-subject world, I wonder if you could just walk us through karma and how that works in this context and how it could serve as a resource for embracing a fuller relationality in the world.
Yeah, I mean, so karma literally means action. And before Buddhism, so in kind of Vedic times, in the pre-Buddhist kind of ritual culture of India, you engaged, and it was the word that was used for ritual action there. Um, and so you engage in rituals or ritual actions, karma, to bring about a certain kind of result. Um, and in as Buddhism comes along, there's a more, and it was kind of understood as well, if you do these actions correctly, physically, then you get your result. Buddhism really emphasized the psychological element, right? The intention is really important, but they kept that idea of world building, that the world that you are inhabiting as a conditioned being is conditioned by your actions. And there's both an individual element and a collective element of that. There's also what I like Rupert Gethin, a scholar of Buddhism, talks about the psychological and the cosmological aspects of karma. And I think that the psychological is easier for us to see, right? If we engage in certain actions, this is transforming our experience. Um, if I, right, start being more generous, in my day-to-day actions, right? This is going to transform my experience of the world. The world seems like a friendlier place when I'm doing that kind of thing. And so we can see it in our own habits and actions in our personal lives. It's a little bit more difficult to conceive on this larger cosmological scale, which in traditional Buddhism, we talk about realms of rebirth. And I think that's an uncomfortable place uh, for people to go to for a variety of reasons. Um, However, we can also think about it just in terms of this world that we're inhabiting together right now, right? And how all of our actions collectively are creating um, not just physically the world, but the world psychically uh, that we inhabit, socially.
Could you give some examples of where that shows up?
Yeah. So, I mean, we could look at maybe at our current conditions in the US, which are pretty extreme in terms of polarization, right? And this is the more, polarized my uh, thinking, the more us and them, the more that creates this kind of tensions in the world. Or we can think about it in terms of the natural world. So, uh, kind of how I choose to relate, just my physical actions, my mental actions, whether I'm talk to my plants, whether I'm engaged, how this is going to, um, transform my experience. But also, if you're in a group that is relating in a certain way, that transforms kind of the world as how it's presented or how we experience it. So certain things, ways of being and knowing become possible in certain social circumstances where they're not in other social groups. Would be a function, you could say, of karma, this kind of shared or collective karma. That's
I just, as you're speaking, that just an example came to mind, which maybe is a slight wrinkle in where we're seeing action or karma showing up, but we can see this kind of interaction between our attitudes or our ideas, the practices or the ways of behaving that emerge based on those ideas, and then the experience that we have. And that experience can then change our ideas and it can change our conduct. So
yeah,
this interaction, and
yeah,
in a recent retreat that we did in Argentina, we had we did this it was a retreat on Tonglen practice, giving and taking practice, and we did Tonglen for our self of the past. And one of the activities, we had some days of silence, so we needed to give people silent activities to do, and one of them was writing a letter to yourself of the past from where you are now. So we did that on one day, and then the next day there was the invitation to find a tree, because it was a forested retreat space, find a tree and read the letter to the tree as if the tree were there holding or representing yourself of the past. And one of the practices that we sort of played with in there was, before you do that, ask permission of the tree, explain what you want to do, and ask the tree if it's okay with the tree. And so this is a practice that you can do without any animist worldview, without any sense that the tree might have a subjectivity or the ability
mhm,
to give or not give permission. But by creating this habit of asking permission, that assumes that there's a subject there. And so it opens you up to the idea. And people, started to sense like, yeah, I think the tree, I think, like I feel a receptivity here. I, you start to imagine that the tree is sensing you, which the trees are sensing our presence, right? So just this kind of way that action can kind of slip in opportunities to reconfigure our the experience of our relationship and our understanding of who we're in relationship with.
Yeah. And maybe this shared social aspect to elaborate. So I had a retreat that was a Qigong retreat I was on for a Qigong teacher training. And so we had been practicing, maybe your audience knows what Qigong is, but kind of the like sort of like Tai Chi, where you're working with the Qi, with the energy through physical movements. And it's very related to both spiritual and medical practices and um,
We had a retreat member leading qigong sessions in the same retreat as one
okay,
of the
great. So,
alternative to yoga options that we were giving
yeah.
people for movement. So yeah.
So, well, we have a certain social group there that's already kind of a little bit open, but we were one of the activities was to go and practice our qigong with a tree,
Mhm.
and and I'd done a little bit of practice. Actually, one of the most profound practices I had with the natural world was with trees and kind of sensing a kind of reciprocal, like after I'd been doing a lot of qigong, and so I think there is something there to that physicality of that practice that helps open this up. Um, but yeah, people came away with all kinds of and the imagination is engaged, and maybe part of it is imagine, part of it is play and kind of opening, but then maybe that is the space in which a kind of uh interspecies communication can happen. Um, Maybe the requirement for that is getting out of our ordinary kind of human language modes of thinking and inhabiting the world in a more physical way. And but also allowing uh, the imagination to help transmit something that maybe we can't formulate exactly in our rational, ordinary ways of thinking. And we see this too across all kinds of spiritual traditions, right? The imagination. This is one of my other projects. Um, that the imagination is we've kind of downplayed it as a kind of mode of fantasy or maybe a way of thinking and planning, but imagination as a kind of uh, tool for knowing, a different means of knowing and communicating. And again, across cultures, we see that it's one of the primary ways that we can communicate, or that human beings have understood themselves to be communicating with the more than human world. So but you need a kind of collective space where those kinds of actions, both mental, physical, verbal, are well, allowed one, right? This isn't the kind of thing you're normally going to go to Central Park and do. But it's there you're co-creating a kind of a world together with the trees as well as the human beings participating in that exercise. And so uh, I think we can understand that as kind of the possibilities for karma. I mean, karma traditionally in Buddhism, right? This is something uh, in for much of Buddhist history, there's this idea that you want to escape, right? Escape the cycle of rebirth and karma, escape the world. But we can also see as long as we're here in this world, what we're experiencing, we are creating together. And so maybe there's better ways that we can do that. Um,
Yeah, and so you mentioned also the cosmological element of karma. Could you talk a little bit about that?
there's karma as we can observe it in our lives, in our own psychological lives, in our social lives. Um, and And then there's that extends in the traditional Buddhist worldviews, it extends over lifetimes. And so conditions not only moment to moment in this life, but our actions also condition the next life. So that's all he means by the cosmological dimension of karma. Um, and again, I think we can think of this as collectively. We don't have to think about it as far in the future, some other rebirth, other world. We are continually being reborn and recreating our world together, right? In this in this very life.
one of the things that I sort of had in mind thinking about cosmological karma is that the notion that the consciousness that is currently a human consciousness, which is to say a human animal consciousness, can also be a non-human animal consciousness just as easily, in this cosmological worldview. And we don't quite get to, plant intelligence in that cosmology, but at least we do get beyond humans as the measure of what it means to be sentient.
That's something that is, I think, maybe sometimes disappointing when you go and look for resources for thinking animistically with Buddhism, and you go to look at early Buddhism, right, we find is and kind of ambiguous about plants. Um, a little bit later, there's no plants are not not sentient. Um, and so we find other other Indian cultures of the time, other South Asian cultures had understood plants to be part of this larger cycle of rebirth, um, and to be a common way that they were thought of as having, how human beings have the five senses plus the mind as the sixth sense. And so plants were conceived as having the sense of touch. So they had a kind of consciousness related to touch. I think if we think about what we know about plant intelligence these days, it seems they're using much more than just touch. Um, but this was based on observation of the natural world. So the way plants turn towards the sun, the way they like grow right towards water. Um, and so in early Buddhism, they're included in like, for example, in um, the Karaniya Metta Sutta. They're included as um, if you want to become someone who excels in loving kindness, then you should like wish for the well-being of uh, all all creatures, mobile and all beings, mobile and stationary, and the stationary ones are the plants. Um, but this puts Buddhists in an awkward position when it comes to the precept, right? Not to harm living beings. And so does then eating plants, does that constitute, or farming plants, does that constitute, where you're then, cutting up your crops en masse, does that constitute violating that precepts? And so they were kind of this borderline area. A borderline species is what one scholar
Mhm.
of Buddhism calls them. Um, but then in Mahayana Buddhism and later Theravada Buddhism, they've kind of decided no, they aren't
They don't
sentient.
experience
They don't
pain
experience
or
pain.
harm, right?
Right, exactly. Um, and maybe that's also part of an anthropocentrism is that, well, do they experience it like us? Maybe they
Mhm.
have a different way of experiencing. Maybe it's even hard for us to talk about it as experience, but there's clearly something alive. And I would say arguably intelligence, maybe a very, very different kind of intelligence than human beings in terms of plants learning and actually being capable of memory and communicating with each other, communicating cross species. It's actually,
Caring for one another.
yeah. So I guess when I'll just add one sort of postscript to that is then when we get later into East Asian Buddhism, we find this kind of idea of the whole entire world is permeated by a kind of Buddha nature, Buddha mind. Um, and then that really transforms how you think of uh, other than human beings, as well as how you think of awakening. What does it mean to awaken and, realize that Buddha mind is your own? Um, so I think that's another kind of resource for reorienting and transforming the way we're relating to the more than human natural world.
Mm-hmm. So, as a last question, I want to invite you into your favored topic of imagination, um, and ask you to imagine for us how Buddhist practitioners in the Americas and Europe might be engaging differently with the more than human world and might be experiencing their relationality differently if these more animistic resources in Buddhism were brought more to the center of what Buddhist practice is understood to be.
Yeah. And here, I'm not sure how much I have to engage my imagination because this sort of my interest in the kind of historical background and what did Buddhists actually think about plants and all, it was kind of prompted by my experience in kind of eco-dharma circles where there was already this transformation taking place, people kind of cobbling together a kind of practice based on, they were practicing Buddhist, but they felt there wasn't enough resources and how that was being presented to engage with the more than human world in the way that they felt was they were called to do at this time, both, individually and as a sense of responsibility for the world. And so were already everywhere. I went like in some activist circles and more Dharma circles, but Buddhist oriented, were already practicing um, with the natural world in a way of kind of opening themselves up to the intelligence and communications with the natural world. Decentering the human being in that story doesn't mean we're not 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 writing us out of the story.
And what shifts when you do that?
I guess a sense of separation. So understanding myself, my physical being, my mental being, being more continuous with the more the natural world. And so those barriers falling away to some extent. Um, and not having everything driven by one's own individual ego, but sort of opening to respond. And I can't say that I'm no I've not mastered the here I am imagining. Uh, I've just had little tastes of it in some of my practice. Um, So I think it's already happening. I think it's organically happening. And I guess what I've been trying to do, probably not that well today, but I've been trying to articulate uh, how we can think about that in terms of, yeah, resources that we find in Buddhism. How come the Buddhism that's presented in a sort of more Buddhist, modernist, rationalist way, how it came to lack those resources? Um, what we can do to rehabilitate some of these concepts, which again have been happily cohabitating, dependent origination, right? Happily cohabitating with a much more expansive and inclusive worldview, traditionally cohabitating with many different kinds of animisms in different Buddhist cultures. But I don't know that we can just replicate, right? We're in our own time and place. I don't think, and I think these things, right? Animistic practice are very much tied to place. So I don't think you can just take one from the Himalayas and recreate it here. And maybe we have to find our own, use the Buddhist practices to find our own ways of relating to the spaces and landscapes and beings that we are living with in our own particular homes.
Mhm. Well, I said that was going to be the last question, but do you think it's possible to awaken in the Buddhist sense of awakening without experiencing our relatedness to plant and mineral and all animal beings?
Uh, the historian wants to me wants to say, well, which kind of Buddhist awakening are you talking about? But I guess keeping it very simple, right? Because there's been different conceptions of what this involved, whether it's kind of a transcendent or imminent kind of awakening, awakening in the world to the world or transcending the world. Um, but at a very basic level, uh, it seems that if the fundamental problem is this self-grasping and is the craving related to this self-grasping, then the fundamental way, if that's the fundamental problem, then the basic way of freeing would be to let go to that, which I think all means opening opening the heart to whatever else is out there. So human beings, more than human beings, um, and even maybe even beings that we think of as more elemental, right? Mineral, and so
Mhm.
on. So what does that look like when the heart has let go of that self-grasping and has opened up to that?
That's a question we're all trying to find out.
Yeah, I'm not going to answer it, but
But it does seem to me that anthropocentrism is just a larger version of egocentrism. So as long as that's still where our practice is focused and where our relationality is understood to take place, we're not there yet.
mhm,
However, we want to understand awakening to be, if self has just gotten much bigger and more complex, we're not there yet.
mhm.
Thank you so much for all of these reflections on some of how we're not there yet, and what steps we could explore taking to be more expansive in our experience of dependent and origination, and who and what and where we are. Thank you so much, Karin.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.